So we're back. Just a brief overview of the table of contents. With the table of contents, it should be linkable. I didn't find out until after I'd used drive-through for a couple of uploads that if you add a watermark, that it might be taking out these hyperlinks. So I'm not going to watermark this. I may change the layout of this, but I tried to highlight the main sections with capitalization and then all of the tables, because oftentimes it's a table that you're seeking. You're most likely to be seeking a table. So I wanted those to stand out a bit. Unfortunately, in some cases, tables are stacked right on top of each other. And I think I'm not really helping matters by having all of that stuff bolded. I don't know. But that's what I was thinking. Forward. So essentially, what I do believe is that this 1973 playtest version of OD&D was worth looking at in its fully expanded form. What would have happened if this was what went to market after somebody who cared for it and had plenty of time, right? I've been working on this from June. It's late November now. So what would have been like if somebody had sufficient time to lay out all of the things that were promised in Beyond This Point Be Dragons and bring it to market? And I kept the name Dragons Beyond because, right, the whole idea is still the same, right? Somewhere out there in the great beyond, you're going to run into who knows what. And that's where the real adventure takes place. We're pretty sure at this point, based on the research that others have done, D.H. Boggs, John Peterson, those folks, that what we've got in our hands is legitimately part of the chain of drafts going back and forth. Now, this may have been a typed up version for playtesting that had some things that weren't being passed back and forth between Arnson and Gygax, but there's just way too much stuff that puts it somewhere between the Mornard fragments, I always get that wrong, and the actual published version of OD&D that came out in '74. Anyway, moving forward, I just jump right into it, right? Instead of having a whole document, what's an RPG? Let's define some terms. Let's talk about dice and how to read this. I just assume that knowledge, right? If you're interested in zero edition adventure, you probably already know what classes are, what levels are, what an RPG is, how to roll dice, what polyhedrals are, all of that stuff. So we're just skipping straight to the meat of it, which is classes. Now, the interesting difference here is that fighting men have a real restriction on using non-weapon magic items based on their intelligence. So intelligence for a fighter is not a dump stat by any means, because it's the gateway to them being able to utilize magical armor. Very important stuff. We're looking at a table right now that's not fully formatted. So again, this is version 0.84 we're looking at this point. So forgive some of these minor formatting errors. They'll be cleaned up before it's published. The other interesting thing is this progression, right? It was called fighting capability inside OD&D and inside the draft document for Beyond This Point Be Dragons. But I've broken that out into two columns. One of them is improved damage and the other is additional attacks. There is no clear guidance until strategic review about what that fighting capability meant in terms of additional attacks or perhaps additional damage. So I felt free to reinterpret this as actually any melee. The improved damage can apply to any hit done on any figure in melee. And again, the in melee piece is not in there yet. But additional attacks, right? So in this case, a warrior could potentially take on two others. The real linguistic twist was, and Beyond This Point Be Dragons, it says basically to put the fighting capability reflects their ability to be put on an equal footing, right, with when they're facing multiple opponents. So I've taken that nuance and ran with it and said, look, if you're not facing multiple opponents, you don't get to use these additional attacks. These simply say, hey, if 3 guys are coming at me and I am a swordsman, which is a 3rd level fighter, I get 2 additional attacks. I can handle all three of those guys. I can whack all three of those and get my chops in. Now, if I'm a level 3 swordsman facing a single person, I don't get those other 2 chops, right? It's simply there to reflect my capability when there are multiple targets of opportunity. The other thing that makes this interesting is in 0 edition, the language says, at least as interpreted by a strategic review, was that this additional attack is only reflective of a fighter facing off against lower level or lower hit dice opponents. I've ditched that. I don't think that's correct, because that would mean that a swashbuckler, let's say a level 5 fighter facing off against a level 4 hero, the swashbuckler would get multiple attacks and the hero would not. That just doesn't make sense to me. I can't reconcile that. So I've ditched that. Magic users. Let's flip over to the other page. Magic users. The most interesting thing about Beyond This Point Be Dragons is it actually says that magic users can use armor. Now, the armor has a chance based on, again, cold iron, and I'm pretty sure it says cold iron specifically in those rules. Cold iron is what's interfering with the magical casting ability and potentially the armor impinging on your ability to make all those wild moves when you're casting spells. Anyway, what this means for magic users is they have options, right? If you want to take the chance, you can carry around a shield. You can put on a helmet. You can have some leather armor. It might make your spell have some lesser impact than you wanted, but there's going to be some effect potentially on your spell casting. Now, Beyond This Point Be Dragons, it says that it gives it one example about a lightning bolt, and it still says it's going to go off, but maybe it ends up in the wrong place. What I've done is I've taken a look back to chainmail, the rules out of which the stuff originated, said, look, chainmail has spell negation and it has spell delay as potential consequences during casting of a complexity of spell. I took those concepts and this other idea of the magic has been interfered with. There's some kind of manifestation that's going to happen. Not sure what it is. I'm leaving that to the referee to determine. But your effects here are delay 1 round, delay 2 rounds, some manifestation that you have no idea what's going to happen, or negation, outright negation, right? If you're wearing plate mail, forget it. You're not. You can cast, but the effect is you've wasted the spell and nothing is going to happen. All right, moving on to the next thing. Magic users can use bows, and it says bows and then magical items capable of doing harm. Does that mean that a magic user can use a sword? Well, we'll get to that later, but yeah, in these rules, magic user will have the ability to use a certain kind of magical sword. Can the magic user use a mace? I have been trained to nail down every nail that's sticking up, right? That's the kind of professional training that I've had. It goes so against what I've been trained to do when drafting a document that it drives me nuts, but I've left this ambiguous on purpose. So if you look at this and say, Rodney didn't give us enough guidance here. Well, I don't want to give you enough guidance. I want you to figure it out on your own. My argument with Gygax, right? Gygax, when he drafted AD&D and started pushing AD&D as the one way to the light, his concept was AD&D is a rule set that's sufficiently codified that any referee that has internalized those rules should be able to, at a convention, run a convention module and fairly score players so that they get a score and so that there can be prizes or whatever, or standings, who knows. But Gygax was very adamant about trying to push back against the fact that AD&D was subject to much interpretation. His stance throughout Dragon Magazine, if you look at what he's written, was very much against what he had written before in 0 edition, right? And very much against the direction that the Basic Expert was taking. He thought it was too open to interpretation and wanted to nail down every nail. Well, I'm not doing that. I think every table should be able to take this rule set and take their own spin on it. Maybe the magic user in your game can pick up a magic mace. I don't know. I'm not going to say they can't. I'm not going to do it. Anyway, that's enough beating that dead horse. Let's talk about magic users have the capabilities to create things. We knew that already. We'll get to magic item creation later in the domain play section. But again, this fighting capability, I've given them improved damage and additional attacks. The other thing I'll say about improved damage is that you'll notice with the fighter in improved damage, sometimes it moves backwards. That's just the way my interpretation of the table made it seem. So I also think there's a real world precedent for that, right? 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes when you're trying something new, you're expanding your capabilities. These swordsmen or men at arms, they're very well trained, but to reach the next level, sometimes you got to break it and then rebuild. And I think my interpretation of what fighting capability means and having these occasional steps backwards gives it a little bit more flavor. And then I'll mention hit points here. We'll come to hit points later, but hit points progression, you'll see are markedly different between the fighting man and the magic user. They still use D6, but the fighting man gets the most hit points. Hit points later, you'll see that I'm saying you can re-roll hit points at any level. And I'm not saying that you can't put other rules in there, or you couldn't just do like we always do, which is just, okay, I've leveled up, I'm going to add 1 dice now if I'm a fighting man. I think re-rolling hit points, because hit points are an abstraction about your ability to dodge and weave as much as take physical punishment. I think having that interesting flavor of, at 3rd level, I rolled 3d6, I got 18 hit points. At 4th level, I take a re-roll of all 4 dice, and this time it only comes up 12 hit points. I think that's quite possible too, right? That as you're progressing, as you're advancing, as you're taking punishment, as you're doing training, as you're in a different season with your body and with your life, that occasionally those hit points can take a backward step too. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that adds realism in addition to being an obstacle the players have a chance to overcome through good gameplay.